Okay, thank you, President Randy. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Richard Peterson. Pete earned his master's and PhD degrees from Kent State University. So he is an alumnus who's come back to Kent virtually to speak to us today. Pete is Professor Emeritus of English at Southern Illinois University. He is the author of Extra Innings, Writing on Baseball, Growing Up with Clemente, and Pops, the Willie Stargell Story. And he is the editor of both the Pirates Reader and the St. Louis Baseball Reader. His essays have appeared in the Chicago Tribune and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and he lives in Makanda, Illinois. Please give a warm Rotary welcome to today's speaker, Richard Peterson. Take it away, Pete.
That was such a disappointing welcome. Franco Harris received a much better welcome over the weekend at the draft that was held in Cleveland. He came out to announce the second round pick for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he was roundly booed by the Cleveland audience. And he said, "Thank you for the Cleveland welcome." So I was hoping maybe that I'd get a round of boos before I started speaking. I could even have put this on. This is a terrible towel mask, something that the Steeler fans have been waving at Cleveland Browns fans for quite a few decades. I want to thank Will for inviting me. Will is a good friend, and he's been such a generous individual. He's provided me with so much support over the years. It's nice to come back to Kent. My wife Anita and I spent 3 years from 1967 through 1969. And it was among the happiest years of our lives. I got 2 degrees, and we left with 2 daughters after that period of time. One family note about the Turnpike Rivalry. When I was done with the Willie Stargell biography, my son asked me what I would do next, and I gave him the classic Danny Glover line. I said, "I'm too old for this," and he said, "Well, but what about if I come up with a topic?" And he came up with a topic on the Pittsburgh Pirates and their infamous loss on Sid Bream's slide. So we wrote together the slide, Jim Leland, Barry Bonds, and the Star-Crossed Pittsburgh Pirates. After that was published, he once again approached me and said, "What are we going to do this time?" And I said, "Again, I'm too old for this." And he said, "How about if I come up with another interesting topic?" And I said, give it a shot. And he said, "Let's do the Cleveland Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers." My immediate reaction was maybe that should be co-authored between a Browns fan and a Steelers fan. But we had the generational thing going. I started watching the Steelers lose to the Browns in the 1950s, and Stephen was watching the Steelers beat the Browns in the 21st century. So the collaboration seems to have worked out. So far as the book is concerned, there are rivalries, and then there are rivalries, and I can't imagine a better rivalry, a fiercer rivalry than one between the Cleveland Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. The most obvious one is propinquity, proximity, the nearness between the city of Pittsburgh and the city of Cleveland. They're so close to each other that it seemed inevitable that there would be some sort of rivalry. Couldn't happen in baseball because the Cleveland Indians are in the American League, but it certainly happened in the National Football League. There's also the character of the 2 cities. I grew up on the south side of Pittsburgh. It's a working class neighborhood, shot in a beer joints. It was reached a point where growing up, you either ended up in juvenile court for stealing tires, or you played sports or rooted for Pittsburgh teams, which was probably worse than stealing tires. They were so awful during that period of time. I'm well aware of the working class character of Pittsburgh, and I'm sure you're well aware of the working class character of Cleveland. The original title for the book was supposed to be A 6-Pack Ride Along the Turnpike, and that's a borrowing from a Cleveland writer. Kent State University Press decided maybe that was going too far out on a limb, so it became the Turnpike Rivals. So there's the initial attraction. and repulsion, I guess I should add, between the cities of Cleveland and Pittsburgh. They're so much alike that somebody once said that it's sort of like twins who can't get along with each other. You know, they just keep fighting and fighting and fighting, and it's manifested primarily in their football teams. As far as the rivalry itself is concerned, people have wondered, well, it shouldn't be a rivalry because they've rarely been good at the same time. During the 1950s and 1960s, the Browns were terrific. The Steelers were so awful that we called them the same old Steelers, based upon an Art Rooney comment when he asked about the improvement of his team when they changed their name from the Pittsburgh Pirates to the Pittsburgh Steelers. He says they look like the same old Pirates to me. And so the same old Steelers became a kind of trademark of that team. If I came back from a Steelers game, my dad asked me how the Steelers did, I'd just say SOS, and he knew exactly what happened during that day. And so when I was growing up, I hated Otto Graham. I hated Marion Motley. He supposedly said that running against the Steelers was like running downhill. The only pleasure I could take was when the Steelers, who were mean defensively, even though they lost, when they would make life miserable for Otto Graham, and Graham would end up shouting at somebody like Chuck Noll, who was playing lineman for the Browns at that time. 70s was great, complete turnaround. The 80s, the Browns again dominated. So it's been a seesaw affair. So how do you justify a situation where these teams have rarely been good at the same time? Last year was only their third meeting in the playoffs during 70 years of rivalry. And I think the answer is exactly because they haven't been good at the same time. It's really a relationship of bullies. It's beating the bully over and over again that has created the rivalry. If you look at what sometimes is regarded as the great rivalries in sports, these are contending teams like the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants, or the Dodgers and the Yankees in the World Series. You have those for Cleveland fans. I talked to some of you earlier. If you look at the 1950s, the rivalry was with the New York Giants and Detroit Lions. But those faded once those rivalries were no longer between competitive teams. In the 1960s, you had the rivalry between the Browns and the Baltimore Colts, and that probably one of the most significant victories in Cleveland Browns history, that NFL championship game against when they shut out Johnny Unitas. In the 1970s, the Steelers had the Oakland Raiders, they had the Houston Oilers, but they sort of faded out, and neither team is located in Oakland or Houston anymore. So that's in the nature of rivalries. But when you have a rivalry where teams are not good at the same time, they tend to bully each other, and that's what fans remember. They remember losing again and again and again. I saw the Steelers lose 8 straight times to the Browns in the 1950s before they finally won a game in 1955. That is one of the most memorable games I've ever experienced because we beat the Browns, finally beat the Browns. So that's in the nature of the rivalry. I think I would argue it's one of the greatest rivals, not the greatest rivalry in professional sports, because they have been good at the same time, because fans tend to perceive the other team as a bully. And it shifts from time to time. When the Steelers beat the Browns in the 1970s, they said, we finally beat the bullies. When the Browns finally won a game at Three River Stadium, they said, we finally beat the bullies. That's been the trademark of the rivalry. And then just one last thing, and I'd be happy to answer your questions. There have been some interesting connections, like Chuck Noll, for example, who played football at Dayton and became a lineman for the Cleveland Browns and eventually greatest coach in Steeler history. You have Buddy Parker coming to the Steelers in the late 1950s. Bobby Lane coming to the Steelers in the 1950s after playing championship games against the Browns. You have the Kent State connection, do you not, with Jack Lambert, who became the Darth Vader for Cleveland Browns fans during the 1970s. You have James Harrison, who became the Darth Vader in the 1990s and in the early 21st century. So the number of connections. You have Ben Roethlisberger, who wanted to play for the Cleveland Browns and was passed over in the draft. So there's a colorful aspect to the rivalry as well. It's not just bullying, but there's so many connections like this. Bill Cowher, who played football with the Cleveland Browns, who was assistant coach with Marty Schottenhauer and then went on to coach the Pittsburgh Steelers. Marty Schottenheimer, who played football with Pitt before eventually becoming the coach of Cleveland Browns. So Will, that's pretty much it in the way of background. I'd be happy to answer any questions that people may have about the rivalry.
Okay, what kind of questions do we have for Pete today?
Hey, what do you think are maybe the top 3 highlights of your book on the Browns Steelers rivalry?
I think any Steeler fan would say it would be that first victory over the Browns in 1955. The Steelers had never defeated the Browns, and they won that game 55-27. It was just stunning that this finally happened. The Steeler fans would also point to the game between the Cleveland Browns and the Pittsburgh Steelers that happened in 1972. The Steelers had never won any kind of championship going into the 1972 season, and they lost on a last-second field goal by Don Cockcroft, 18-16, a game that put them in jeopardy. They came back to Three River Stadium, and I remember a Pittsburgh sports writer said, "If there's any justice in the world, if justice is even-handed, the Steelers have to win this game." And they won the game 30-0. I wrote an article about it in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette called "Beating the Bully." So those are the games that would stand out for Steeler fans. There was a playoff game where the Browns had a huge lead over the Browns, and they ended up losing 36-33. Those would be the top 3 for the Steeler fans. I could turn this around and ask if any Cleveland Brown victories over the Steelers, beside the one, the obvious one where you almost beat our quarterback to death with a helmet.
That was
any Brown Steeler games come to mind for Cleveland fans?
I was a Dallas fan growing up because I grew up in Tampa, which we didn't have a team when I grew up in Tampa. And it was always Dallas versus Pittsburgh. And I loved watching the matchup to both of them, and they were pretty evenly matched. Did you write about? I haven't read your book. Did you write about any of those? This is probably in the early '80s, I'm guessing. Did you write about any of that?
Oh yeah, one of the most important things about the book I forgot to mention is that it's not really the sort of thing that you think that you might write for a book like this, where you talk to a lot of fans, you talk to a lot of players, and we did that, and it sort of becomes anecdotal. The book is a true history of the two teams. So the rivalry is within the context of the Steelers beginning in 1933 and the Browns beginning in 1946. And there is a chapter for every decade, 50s, 60s, 70s, going throughout the course of the book. So indeed, those 2 Super Bowls are in the book, including Hollywood Henderson at one point saying Terry Brown was so stupid he couldn't speak if you wanted him a C in the A. That is in the book. I couldn't resist that.
All right, well, I have to read it because I'm interested. I love both teams. They were both very competitive at that time.
I should warn Cleveland fans that everything that caused you absolute misery in the 1980s is in the book. Red Right 88, the fumble, the drive, that drop pass in that playoff game that I mentioned. It's all there for you.
How much longer do you think Ben Roethlisberger's got?
What's that about? I didn't catch the.
How much longer do you think Ben Roethlisberger is going to be able to play?
I think he's working on -1. I'm a little worried about this coming year. He began to fade at the end of last year. He has a bad elbow, and he just couldn't throw the deep ball in the way that he had in the past. I hope that elbow is better. I hope they have a better season. But this is sacrilege. You're not taping this, are you, Will? But I think
it's being recorded.
I think the Browns are a better team going into the 2021 season than the Steelers.
David, you had a question. Hey, David Dick.
Don't ever tell that I said that to anybody. I believe black and gold.
does your book get into the ownership of the two teams?
Oh, absolutely.
And,
From the very beginning.
Can you
it
describe,
goes-
I haven't read that. Can you describe it a bit?
Oh, yes. It goes back, again, it begins with the ownership in 1946, goes through every owner, including, of course, the infinite Modell. And it goes through all that, including, is it Marshman, who operated a taxi service and actually, in order to give Paul Brown extra players, he hired extra players as taxi drivers. And that's how that the extra players on each team is called the taxi squad. Again, I'm not sure, but I think that was Marshman. So every owner, and there are quite a few for the Cleveland Browns, and of course for the Steelers, that's not a problem. It's Rooney. So that was the easy part of it. But we did a lot of research on the ownership of the Browns, and including the recent ownership that started off so poorly and so terrified Cleveland Browns fans, but now has them in a position to finally get to a Super Bowl.
Thank you. Thank you.
Who, in your estimation, is the best Pittsburgh Steeler ever played?
Oh, when I was growing up, they were so terrible that the only Steeler who made it to the Hall of Fame was Ernie Stautner. Clearly, Mean Joe Green stands out as the most legendary of all the Steelers. But Ernie Stautner weighed 215 pounds, and he was just mean as well. I won't use that word. But I just admired him, and he was just tough. He just personified the Pittsburgh Steelers, that working class mentality. He actually wore casts on his forearms, even though he had no broken bones. And during the course of a game, he would pound Cleveland Brown linemen like Chuck Noll with those casts, so that by the time the fourth quarter came around, the Browns linemen couldn't lift their arms because of what he had done to them. I mean, that's working class. I mean, that's the sort of character.
Well, Terry Bradshaw and Swan wasn't so bad either.
What's that?
Terry Bradshaw and Swan weren't bad either.
Oh yeah, there were just so many terrific ball players. Jack Lampert, considering his size and his tenacity, just a great ball player. And there's some great stories. You mentioned Terry Bradshaw. I mean, he suffered so much during his early days during the Pittsburgh Steelers. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to.
There's a documentary.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I think there was a documentary that previewed some of the earlier Berg days where to your point, he struggled.
Oh,
and I don't know what I'm watching, but it was like, I think he did struggle during his early days.
Oh, he was awful.
And you would know more than I would.
That was the problem.
Okay.
He once said that
I was a Dallas Cowboy fan.
Terry Bradshaw became a sport in Pittsburgh. He said, "What are we going to do Saturday night? Let's boo Terry Bradshaw." He said, "If I pulled up to a light, the car window would roll down and they'd start booing him." There was also a quarterback in Cleveland Brown history. Who was your first round draft pick when the Browns came back?
Tim Couch.
Tim Couch. Tim Couch and Terry Bradshaw have something in common. They both fans booed them and actually cheered when Bradshaw was hurt and taken off the field, and when Couch was hurt and taken off the field. They cheered to get them out of the games.
It's not as bad as Phillies fans booing Santa Claus.
Well,
but I do have a question for you.
I'm not sure if Santa Claus would get out alive in Pittsburgh and Cleveland.
Yeah. I sure hope so. Otherwise, our kids would be super disappointed.
Well,
I do have a question for you. How on earth did they ever wear those horrible Bumblebee uniforms? Did they actually ever wear those? And does that explain why they were so unsuccessful?
They did everything in the 1940s and in the 50s, including changing uniforms. Chuck Noll once said that one of the most laughable things about the Pittsburgh Steelers in the 1950s is they actually wore different colored helmets. The different shades of gold because it was such a ragtag outfit during that time. But they did wear those Bumblebee uniforms. They wore uniforms that looked like convicts because they were striped. I don't know if those were the same as the Bumblebee uniforms, but they were awful. They were originally Pittsburgh Pirates, by the way. And by the way, the first Cleveland team to an NFL championship was actually the Cleveland Rams, right? And they won the championship in 1945 and then went to Los Angeles in 1946. So Cleveland fans have the distinction of watching an NFL championship team in 1945 and seeing that championship team make history by moving to Los Angeles. I think that was when Reeves was the owner of the team. One of the reasons he left, of course, was that they were forming the AAFC, the All-American Football Conference, and he knew that Cleveland was going to have a team in that conference. And that's when it begins the glorious history for Cleveland Browns fans, 4 championships in the AAFC, and then the continuation through 3 championship seasons in the 1950s and even more as the decade went along. I was just going to say very, very quickly that when the Browns came into the NFL in 1950, their first game was against the Philadelphia Eagles because they were defending champions. And most fans and most owners in the NFL thought that this was a joke, that the Browns weren't in this, excuse the pun, weren't in the same league as the Cleveland Browns. The Cleveland Browns destroyed them in that game, and the immediate reaction was they belong.
Any other questions for Pete? If not, Pete, we have a tradition in our club that one of our members respond to the speaker. And today that's going to be Chaz Madonio. So Chaz, take it away.
Thank you, Pete. That's a very interesting presentation you made today. Anytime you talk about the Browns and the Steelers, it's got to be interesting. I've been a lifelong Browns fan. I can remember as a little kid, my older brother would take me up to the Browns games. We'd drive up to Van Aken and take the rapid transit into the Terminal Tower. Then we would stop off at the Royal Castle hamburger joint and have some onion burgers and go to the game. I can remember in 1957, he took me to an exhibition game, which is what they used to call the preseason games. It was at the Rubber Bowl. They were playing the Green Bay Packers, and Lombardi hadn't even taken over as coach yet. That's how long ago this was. They had a rookie quarterback that year, the Heisman Trophy winner, Paul Hornung, who later went on to a Hall of Fame career as a halfback. So I got to see Paul Hornung in one of his very first games. I made a big mistake in 1999. I bought 4 season tickets for the Browns. And I made a mistake every year for the next 15 years by renewing that. I did a little calculating. There were about 120 games played over that time. And I think I was at about 100 of them and saw between 25 and 30 wins out of 100 games. And the seats, I spent $51,000 over that 15 years on the seats. So that came out to about $1,700 per win, which is a pretty expensive price to pay. But I have seen some great things there. I saw the Bottlegate game. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, the Browns were robbed of a victory in the last play of the game, and the fans got very irate and started throwing bottles on the field. Our seats were in the first row of the upper deck, which meant all the people behind us were throwing their bottles, trying to get them to the field, but they were only getting as far as we were sitting. We spent about 15 minutes dodging bottles trying to get out of there. And also the famous Helmet Gate, where the Browns had won the game. The game was over. The teams had gone back into the locker rooms, but on the last play, a bonehead named Dwayne Rudd threw his helmet in celebration, and the referees called it unsportsmanlike conduct penalty, brought the teams back out onto the field. I think it was Kansas City, I can't remember, but they kicked a field goal with no time remaining. The Browns lost that one. They came up with every possible way to lose, and they even invented a few new ones. But my favorite memory of the Browns was the 1964 championship game when they beat the Baltimore Colts. And I still have the ticket to that game, which is hanging on my wall at the office, which I brought to show everybody. I know you probably can't read that. But it was a championship game in 1964, December 27th, and I paid $6 for that ticket. back in those days. That would be the equivalent of a Super Bowl. So a Super Bowl now would probably cost 1,000 times more than that. Anyways, anytime anybody talks about the Browns, I'm always interested. This was a very interesting presentation. And on behalf of the club, I'd like to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Autogate is in the book.
Thanks much, Chaz, and thank you much, Pete, for being with us today and keeping this rivalry going. We're going to end the meeting today, and everyone have a great week.